Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. This episode is a review of Trial Day 10, which is on Friday. Although closing arguments were scheduled for that day, they will now be on Monday, Trial Day 11, and likely we will then see the conclusion of the trial likely on Trial Day 12, possibly on Tuesday or Wednesday, following jury deliberation. The vibe for the journalists going into court on Trial Day 10 was certainly different. Elise Schmelzer tweeted early on that it just felt like a busy day. This last day, there was there were a lot more people in court. There was local and apparently international media present. And it seemed like a lot was going to happen because Day 10 was also the day that the defense would have their chance to address the court. It was also a day that the prosecution was going to finish and finalize their case. Interestingly, if you look at images of Trial Day 10, it seems to be one of the first, if not the only day where the sky was sort of kind of a milky color. It was sort of a very cirrusy, kind of blurry day. All the other days just seemed to be very bright and sunny, and this day was sort of hazy. And true to form, that the day got off to a sort of a hazy start. When a witness arrived, there was sort of a blocking off of the view of the witness arriving. I'm not sure whether that had been happening every day, but it was certainly made obvious that day, possibly because there's a larger contingent of media. But yeah, it's certainly possible that they were trying to protect the identity of a particular witness, which we'll get to. One of the reasons the media were, a sort of larger media contingent were present, was because of the question sort of floating over the trial after 9 days, and that question was, would Patrick Frazee testify? And I've been in that situation myself, where there was a triple axe murderer, and I attended trial, drove a long way to attend the trial, and when I arrived, he didn't testify. He ultimately did, but the day that I arrived, he elected not to testify, and that was unusual in itself, because it is protocol in a defense scenario that the first witness needs to be the defendant, rather than coming in after experts, because you can then tailor your evidence. You know, there's sort of a situation where the prosecution is going to cross-examine based on their own evidence, based on their own insights, and obviously if the defendant testifies first and then his own experts contradict him, then that's a plus for the prosecution. This is why the defendant testifies first. So just to address very quickly the issue of Frazee not testifying, first of all, I think it was the right decision from a legal point of view. It's arguable whether it was the right decision from his point of view. It's difficult to say how good a performance he could have given on the stand. But I think either way, I don't think he would have had terribly good chances. So whether he did or didn't, I don't think it would have made much of a difference. of course, if he doesn't testify, then I think he has a better grounds for an appeal, just saying that, oh, something occurred to him later on, or like going through the trial transcript, he suddenly realized that XYZ, and then he has grounds for an appeal, and then he can then testify and say, well, I didn't have a chance to speak. I should have spoken. I was given poor advice from my lawyer or something like that. So that's also something to bear in mind. But from a sort of, if you get away from the legal argument, just in a very basic human way, imagine if you are innocent and you are on trial for murder, and it's the murder of someone very close to you, the father of your child or the mother of your child. You've sort of sat through 9 days of false accusations against yourself. You've heard people saying that you did this on your property and you did that, and somebody else saying that you asked them to do this and you did that, and you're going to sit there, and then when you have an opportunity to speak, you're not going to say anything. I mean, that in itself, how many people would not say anything if they were innocent? I don't really think that is the thing to be argued in this case. I think it's certainly in my opinion, it's reasonable to assume Frazee is culpable of something, and the issue is, can it be proved? Can it be demonstrated? Can he be found guilty by reasonable doubt? Can he meet that? Can the prosecution's case meet the relatively high standard for evidence for a jury to convict, without any doubt? And the fact is, there is some doubt. Kelsey's body is missing, but I think the prosecution's put on a very strong case, and I think they also ended their case very strongly. Okay, and that concludes the sort of introduction to trial day 10. Let's get to the details of the day. Before we get to that, though, please subscribe to this channel, like, share through your networks, leave a comment, and bear in mind, I will be publishing a book called Murder Most Foul on this particular case, so look out for that. Hopefully out before the end of November. Right, so in terms of trial day 10, as I said, it sort of got off to a somewhat murky start. The weather was sort of similarly neither here nor there, and so Carol McKinley referred to the judge calling, in her words, a mysterious closed hearing that morning. And this discussion was to rule on whether to admit evidence. And I don't think it was so much evidence, but it was more to admit a particular witness. And it seems as if this was maybe a surprise witness in terms of the defense. I mean, the fact that this meeting was held seems as if this was a card that was withheld from the defense in some ways. It may not be as black and white as that. Maybe they did mention that they were going to call a witness, but maybe it wasn't noted that they would actually provide proof. In other words, that they would actually provide the I think it's the paper towels on which Frazee wrote his notes. So that may have been the evidence that had to be ruled on. And so probably one of the objections from the defense could have been, well, how do we prove that my client, did this, wrote this, made these notes? And the prosecution would probably argue, well, we've got a handwriting analysis to sort of make that argument. ultimately, I think the judge allowed it for the prosecution, and so that was kind of a victory for them. And this brings us to the jailhouse snitch, and it's certainly a question that, did his testimony clinch the verdict? What made Bentley's testimony really compelling was that it wasn't just a sort of jailhouse snitch sitting in a chair in a courtroom waffling. The prosecution could actually hold up 17 letters that they said were written by Patrick Frazee to a former inmate in jail. Bentley's on probation right now, but in these letters, Frazee asked Bentley to kill witnesses and described where they lived and what they looked like, and it was Greg Slater who confirmed that the descriptions were accurate. So not just the handwriting, but also the where the descriptions of the witnesses also gave these notes and authenticity about them. Just in a very sort of brief sense, we can see through these letters a similarity to Kenney's testimony, that she'd been asked several times by Frazee to kill, right? According to her, 4 times. And here we have the same thing. He's asking another person to kill on his behalf. And what's really interesting with Frazee is you get sort of a hypocritical sense of him. You get the sense that he's very confident and rough and strong and all that kind of thing, and yet in a way, when it comes down to it, is a coward. So for example, even in the way that he murdered Kelsey, he does it kind of in an underhand way. He fools her, he puts something over her face, and he tricks her, right? We can see a similar thing where with Kenney, he sets her up to commit the crime or to clean it up, and then later on he wants to kill her. So we can see how he's a double dealer, how he's a hypocrite, how he's someone who very selfishly schemes in ways to benefit himself. And we can also see how he tries very hard to misdirect, not only with the alleged disposal of Kelsey's remains, but also with trying to have someone else do his dirty work. And so that dirty work included basically a hit list, taking out witnesses that included Krystal Kenney and her family. So Chad Lee, her husband, even CBI agent Slater, Michelle Stein, who's a friend of Kenney's, and then Joseph Moore is one of his closest friends, a rancher, neighboring rancher, who sort of thought of Frazee as his stepson. And of course we know why, because Moore, it was to Moore that Frazee said, no body, no crime, and it obviously made these compromising statements. Now you can see how Frazee seems to operate, which is there's no problem in having someone else do something that he needs done. So then the blame and the focus goes onto that person, and then somewhere along the line then he might want to arrange some sort of accident for that person, thereby absolutely wiping out traces to himself. But I mean, we see the same thing with the cell phone's life after death in terms of Kelsey, how that is trying to misdirect. So we see quite an elaborate effort here to misdirect. I actually contacted a journalist and just asked her they'd sat in court, they'd viewed all of these 17 messages, and I asked her, couldn't you put all 17 messages somewhere, so that one could read all 17, because what was published in the media was a fraction of them. And her response was that they only published what was sort of safe to do, because a lot of the information provided personal information, addresses, descriptions, all that kind of thing. And so, for privacy reasons, they withheld that information. In fact, Bentley's name was also withheld by certain journalists. I think Sam Kramer was one of them, who just simply didn't refer to his name. But there were others who did. I think it was the Gazette, can't recall exactly who it was, but who said that since Jacob Bentley testified in open court, it would mean everybody would have to keep his secret, including members of the public. And the prosecutors did actually ask on his behalf, because that's what he'd asked. He'd asked for his identity to be kept private, and so we can see some media honored that. I don't know if they're still honoring it, but other media didn't honor that, and I support that. I support the fact that if you testify in court, you're making a public statement. It's going to be public. It's going to be part of a public record. So the whole idea that you're going to maintain privacy is kind of moot. It's also why I say this whole idea that you're not going to film, you're going to restrict the publicity of the media, I think is a kind of a cop-out from the court. When you have a trial, you want a proper accounting, and part of that proper accounting is under the media glare. And if you, as a court, don't have the confidence to do that, I think it is a bit reckless. Having said that, there is information about this gang and their attempts to take out district attorneys. I'm not going to say too much about that here, but one can imagine, if you were the prosecutor in this case, that you would want to that you'd be cognizant of that. In any event, coming back to Bentley's notes, what is incredible with those notes is of those that one is able to read, one is able to, where one has access to, you're getting the language of Frazee in his own words. So, we don't hear him testifying in court, but his words speak on his own behalf. And I think it was Scott Reich who said, the best prosecution of a defense witness are his own words, and that is absolutely true. Using their own words to damn them, to condemn them, and nothing is more true than in this case, where you're actually getting these sort of grimy prison issue towels that have been scribbled on, and that is really taking you into Frazee's world, and also into the dirtiness of his headspace. And so you can get the actual language through these towels in how he talks. You can get the way that he's trying to manipulate the neighboring inmate, and he's also suggesting an idea that they're going to continue criminal activities together. He's going to, I don't know whether that's necessarily true, whether Frazee seriously entertained a career in crime, but on the other hand, if he had gotten away with this, one can imagine him working over a long period of time through subterfuge to do certain things and to perhaps cause certain accidents to happen to certain people. So in Murder Most Foul, I am doing statement analysis of some of the statements that he's made on those notes, but one of them that's worth mentioning here is kind of an obvious one. Jacob Rogers refers to Frazee writing that I'm not the monster they say I am, and then he says I don't know what happened or where she went. Honestly, my wheels are spinning out of control the closer it gets to trial. Any advice how to defend my innocence? This reminds me of Jodi Arias's fake diary entries. This is like a fake letter or fake note. But for me, the intertextual element is more the actual words, the actual semantics. And so, if you go to the Chris Watts case, he says the same thing. He referred in the second tranche of discovery that people had been writing to him, telling him he was a monster. And in the first tranche of discovery, we actually hear him saying to the FBI, he's not a monster. He says it quite a few times. It doesn't appear that much in the discovery, but quite a few times he says, I'm not a monster. And it's quite interesting how that word is used both by the public to define these criminals, but also by the criminals to define that's not who they are. Okay, and this brings us to a tweet from Jennifer Kowaleski, referring to the very important point that the lead investigator Slater believed that the letters, the graphology matched samples of Frazee's handwriting, and Kowaleski also at the same time notes that they're not naming the former inmate. Prosecutors asked us not to because he fears retaliation from a prison gang. Now you can imagine not doing that. You don't name this particular inmate, and if you think of it in another way, shouldn't it be well known what these prison gangs, who they are, what they're up to, who their members are? You know what I mean? Shouldn't it be public knowledge? On the other hand, you could say, would this guy have testified if his identity wasn't made public? That's an open point. Maybe he would have, even if it was made public. Maybe he wouldn't have. And then that brings us to Sam Kramer's tweet, referring to the most graphic of the notes, and I will leave you to read that yourself. Again, importantly, from looking at that, his language, you get a sense of Frazee. You get a sense of this other guy. You see this sort of subdued, mild-mannered guy in court. We don't see him, but he's dressed, I guess, quite neatly. And then this is the other Patrick Frazee. There's so many character endorsements, character references from people. Certainly in the media earlier on, just saying he wouldn't harm a fly and is a kind guy and whatever. Well, when you see this written in his own hand, in his own language, you can see his quite a piece of work, right? And then we get to Elise Schmeltz's tweet, which is really important. She says Frazee doesn't admit anywhere in those notes that he killed Kelsey. And so as powerful as the testimony is from this inmate, it's not quite a smoking gun. But think about what you're talking about. He's not admitting to killing Kelsey, but he's asking someone to commit kind of a mass murder. It's quite a few individuals that he once killed. So it's quite a fine line between saying, no, I didn't kill this person, in which I'm charged and I'm sitting in jail for. I'm innocent of that, but please kill these people because I'm a good guy, and so yeah. And that brings us to crime scene reconstruction. And this was a really powerful conclusion to trial day 10. I just want to step away from the court narrative itself and just go into sort of a broader aspect, and that is, when I set up the framework for Murder Most Foul, and I do this for most of my books, the crime scene reconstruction is invariably the final chapter. It's a powerful conclusion. It is a conclusion based on running through all the evidence. It's a conclusion based on evidence. It's a conclusion based on integrating all the testimony, on linking up all the witness statements, all the forensics, through the process of researching a narrative and so on. You must not only get to know the characters really, really well. When I say characters, I don't mean you just get to know their characters. I mean you get to know their identities, their true identities. And that refers to their backstories, their personality, the way they speak, the way they act, their psychology, and thence their criminal psychology. And besides that, you also need to become very familiar with their jobs and what their jobs say about them, and their habits and what they see every day. And then there's also the aspect of the crime scene. You need to become very familiar with the crime scene. What are the perspectives and facades, when you see it from above, inside? How does it, if you sort of rotate it in your mind and you see it through a sort of architecture diagram, and then you float over the terra firma of the ranch and you look through at the topography, what is that telling you? And why are there these distances between A and B, and what is that telling you? And in other words, through the course of the narrative, the narrator also needs to learn the case back to front, inside out, just as the prosecutors do. And but just certainly from a narrator's perspective, and as I say, prosecutors, all trial lawyers need to be good narrators. They need to tell convincing stories and powerful stories, and so to conclude with a crime scene reconstruction is part of that. And that is why this was saved for last. You can imagine, in a previous episode I mentioned how the prosecution was sort of faltered it slightly on day 8 and 9. It sort of lost momentum a little bit. One could say, well, couldn't they have used this on those days rather? In other words, on day 8 do the crime scene reconstruction, on day 9 the inmate, right? And the reason you don't want to do that is you want to end your last day on a very strong note. That's exactly what they did. So they did need to review some of the evidence. They did need to reiterate stuff, and so they saved some of the most potent and visceral evidence for the very end. And part of that is the psychology in terms of a jury. You want the jury to be emotional about what's going on. You want them to be invested. You want them to you want to sort of shock them in a way that this isn't just some kind of ordinary hypothetical. This is someone who died, and you want to really sketch that in detail that's going to stick in their brains. And so that is what has happened, I think. And anyway, this brings us to a quote, a tweet by Sam Kramer referring to video taken around 11:15 on December 21st. So this was a good month after the alleged incident, and Kenney is seen wearing a CBI jacket and hat, and the police, it looks like that they want to conceal her identity on that particular day. So to contextualize Kenney's appearance at the crime scene on December 21st, we need to go back a week in time to see, how that came about, and it was as late as December 14th, 12 days after the police had been alerted to Kelsey's disappearance. The local cops executed a warrant on Frazee's home, and one assumes that they got hold of his phone on that same day, and because that's the same day they contacted Kenney. And so on December 14th, the FBI did a phone interview with Kenney, and this immediately got the antenna up. They felt that she'd provided materially false and misleading information. That's actually in the Frazee affidavit. She was vague. She couldn't be sure what the last time was that she talked with Frazee. Quite simple, just look at your phone. When they sort of pressed her on this issue, she couldn't be more accurate than saying, well, she'd maybe spoken to him within a month or a month and a half. Meanwhile, as we know, they actually spoke to one another as recently as 3 weeks prior. You know, who wouldn't remember talking to him after Thanksgiving, close to Thanksgiving? And it turned out Kenney's phone had received 6 calls from Frazee's landline phone, totaling 160 minutes of talk time. That's a heck of a lot of talking. Kenney's reaction after this call was that she contacted her ex-husband, who testified in court for the prosecution. She told him that she was very nervous, talking about the call about the FBI, and she then made up this fabricated horse story that she went to the ranch to sort out a horse, something that Frazee had probably told her to have handy. So that was her sort of alibi that she had at the ready. And then she'd already started this ruse that she thought someone was setting her up, or maybe that someone was Frazee in a way, but of course they'd both set something up allegedly as well. So the important thing is that the FBI, on their sort of initial contact with her, immediately felt that she wasn't being truthful to them, because she'd actually lied not only to them but also to her ex-husband, and so her goose was cooked sort of virtually immediately. And so as early as a week later, she was in Colorado in situ, taking them through the crime scene. And this brings us to a very powerful but troubling and tragic description by Jacob Rogers of what the crime scene analyst, a guy called Priest, Jonathan Priest, a retired 30-year police officer, and he said that people aren't easy to kill. They're very resilient, and beatings are nasty in that they don't really have the effect they may have on television. And I don't think Frazee anticipated how this crime is going to play out in reality. I think he if he committed the crime, he may have thought as far as wanting Kelsey done away with, but I don't think he actually imagined what that would actually involve. And I think it was a obviously incredibly traumatic thing to have happened to you in terms of Kelsey. I think it was a very painful, I think she suffered incredibly in those last moments. I think it was agonizing and excruciating. It was a very cruel, sadistic death. But I also think, and this is not to sympathize at all with Frazee, simply to recognize that he probably was shocked, and one could even say traumatized by what he was doing. So even though he was doing it himself, I don't think he realized how gruesome it was going to be. Even if he was a cruel guy, I don't think he recognized how it wouldn't be just 1 or 2 blows. Maybe that's what he anticipated, but it ended up being, according to this analyst, 10 to 15 blows. The analyst also confirmed that it had the appearance of a wooden baseball bat striking the ground, confirmed via Sam Kramer's tweet. And the same analyst also refers to bleach as a big DNA killer, just that it's a very, very effective in destroying blood evidence. Jacob Rogers refers to the disturbing visual of blood patterns on a wall consistent with a blood source being low, near the floor, on the floor at the time the impacts were rendered. Again, according to Jacob Rogers, a wall in the living room opposite the front door was described, obviously downstairs, was described as having a large amount of blood down low and then more scattered higher up. According to Rogers, there was blood spatter in the kitchen, on the refrigerator, the coffee maker, high on a wall, consistent with having come from one object bludgeoning a blood source, as in flying off whatever is being swung from one direction to another. Jennifer Kowaleski tweeted about the expert testifying that one could fit a body in a black tote bag. I'm not sure if that's accurate. Shouldn't it be black tote box? But says given the description on the bloodstains, it would take a substantial impact to create. She also refers to the 10 to 15 strikes. It should be clear, but I think the analyst is just being explicit that there was a lot of blood on the scene. So even though very little was found, it was essentially a bloodbath. Jacob Rogers tweets about a significant blood source needed to be there for the blood to flow in there. And this is referring to the living room floorboard. So there were long streaks of blood on the floorboards. It wasn't just a little area. There had to be a fairly large pool of blood to cause these stains. And of course, all of this testimony made huge headlines, sort of breaking news. In the middle of the day, one of the first headlines from the Gazette was that the blood spatter absolutely fits a baseball bat murder. And on that note, the prosecution rested. That was day 10 ended at 1:07 p.m. Along with the surprising news that Patrick Frazee would not testify, and in fact there wouldn't be any witnesses, not even his mother. I've highlighted 3 tweets of the day. The first from Elise Schmalzer, referring to the important fact that Frazee doesn't ever admit to killing Kelsey in the notes or alleged notes. The second tweet is from Jacob Rogers, referring to how resilient people are and how difficult they are to kill in this sort of manual way, through blunt force trauma. And I think one of the most troubling aspects of the day's testimony, and that I think would remain in the minds of the jury, is because it really places you in the mind of the crime scene. You are taking the evidence and you're actually starting to put it together. And it's the moment when the analyst said that a person being beaten to death may have been conscious beyond the first blow, enough to say, please stop. Alright, and that concludes the review of day 10. I'll be back with a review of day 11, which is the closing arguments of both the prosecution and the defense on Monday. And then on Tuesday, possibly, we might get a verdict bringing the end to 12 trial days, and essentially being a little bit less than the 3 weeks originally scheduled for this trial. Until then, thank you for listening.